Here's the thing about Regency gentlemen and their private clubs. They weren't terribly secretive about them. There were subscription lists. There were printed rules. There were hand-delivered invitations with wax seals, for goodness sake. The coffeehouse landlord knew exactly what went on in his back room. The satirists drew it all in delicious detail and sold the prints on street corners. And the wives? Oh, the wives absolutely knew. So the secret wasn't really a secret, it was more of a gentleman's agreement. A very English arrangement, centuries in the making, where everyone understood that certain spaces existed, certain things happened in those spaces, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to ask a single direct question about it. This was England. Direct questions were practically a constitutional offence. These private records shows us something extraordinary about male friendship, desire, and the surprisingly sophisticated social architecture that Georgian England built quietly, deliberately, and with considerable ingenuity to accommodate what it could not officially acknowledge. As we settle in tonight, we're going to discover not just what happened in these rooms, but what it tells us about the surprisingly relatable lives of men who lived in Regency London. But before we begin this journey together, let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching tonight, and please also take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Now, dim the lights and prepare to discover why this story will change how you think about Regency England. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Permission, what these clubs actually were. Tonight, you're in London. The year is 1813. Somewhere in Covent Garden, that glorious, chaotic, wonderfully disreputable neighbourhood where theatres and taverns and coffeehouses all press their shoulders together in the kind of intimacy that polite Mayfair would never have permitted. In the upper room of a tavern on a street that still exists today, 12 men are sitting down to a private subscription dinner. The table has been laid with more care than most of their wives' dinner tables. The wine is better. The fire has been built up against the October chill, and the room smells of coal smoke and candle wax and the remnants of a good roast, and there is something in the air that is harder to name. A quality of ease, of permission, of being somewhere the ordinary rules simply do not apply. One of these men has been writing about evenings like this in his private diary. Not carefully, not with the hedged, euphemistic language he uses everywhere else, the language of public life in Regency England, which was essentially a long practiced art of saying almost everything without saying anything at all. In his diary he writes plainly. He writes about a particular friend who always sits to his left at these dinners. He writes about the way they linger after the others have gone, talking until the candles gutter. He uses the word dear in a way that, even by the standards of an era that flung the word around with considerable generosity, means something quite specific. This diary survived. It is in a collection in London, carefully catalogued, mostly unread, because for a very long time nobody quite knew what to make of it. Tonight we are going to make something of it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When most people picture a Regency gentleman's club, they picture something rather grand. Oak panelling, leather armchairs, a vast fireplace presided over by a porter in full livery who looks as if he's personally affronted by your existence, and possibly a painting of an old duke glowering down from above the mantel. They're picturing White's, or Brooks's, or the Reform Club, and they're specifically picturing the Victorian version of those institutions, the version that had, by the 1850s, calcified into exactly the sort of stiff, ceremonial respectability that the word club now conjures. The Regency was different. The compressed, fascinating decade from 1811, when the Prince of Wales became regent, effectively taking over the country from his incapacitated father George III, to 1820, when old George finally died and his son became king, was something else entirely. The clubs of the Regency were messier, younger, less formal, more dangerous, and infinitely more interesting than their Victorian successors. They were also far more numerous, far more varied, and far less well documented, which is either a problem or an invitation depending on what kind of historian you are. There were, broadly speaking, 3 layers of all-male private space operating in London during this period, and understanding the difference between them matters enormously to our story tonight. At the top, nominally at least, were the grand political clubs. White's in St James's Street, founded in 1693, was technically a Tory establishment, though in practice it functioned mainly as a place where very rich men could lose extraordinary amounts of money at cards and faro without their families receiving the news in quite real time. Brooks's, its Whig counterpart across the street, was essentially the same operation wearing a different political costume. Boodles sat nearby. These grand establishments had printed rules, formal membership procedures, famous addresses, and a veneer of respectability roughly as thick as good parchment. Underneath that veneer, the gambling was legendary. Bets were placed on everything: elections, weather, which of 2 raindrops would reach the bottom of a window pane first. One particularly celebrated entry in White's famous betting book from around 1816 involved 2 members wagering on whether a man who had collapsed in the street outside was dead or merely drunk. The club porter was dispatched to investigate. He was, for the record, dead. The bet stood. Nothing about this was considered remarkable. But these grand establishments, for all their infamy, are not the clubs we have gathered here tonight to discuss, because beneath this first layer, beneath the famous names and the formal membership rules and the slightly terrifying porters, ran a far more varied, far less documented world of private subscription clubs that operated in the coffee houses, tavern back rooms, and private dining rooms of Georgian London. These second-tier clubs had no famous addresses. They used subscription lists rather than formal memberships. Many existed primarily as dinner societies, a fixed group of men who met on a regular schedule, paid their subscriptions into a common fund, and gathered in a private room hired for the purpose. Some were explicitly literary in character. Small circles of men who read manuscripts aloud to each other, argued about poetry, and conducted an ongoing conversation about ideas that their public lives gave them no real room to pursue. The man who sat behind a ledger all day and was expected to discuss weather and horseflesh at the dinner table was, in a private room on a Tuesday evening, the most passionate advocate for the works of Cowper or Crabbe you had ever encountered. Give a Regency gentleman a room without women and a decent claret, and you discovered what he actually thought about things. This was, as a general proposition, more interesting than what he said in mixed company. Some of the subscription clubs were purely social. Groups of men who had known each other since school or university or the army, who found that the ritual of a regular private dinner gave their friendships a structure and a regularity that the chaos of daily life couldn't otherwise supply. And some were something else entirely, something that didn't have a clean name in 1813 and is therefore all the more interesting to examine. Then there was the third layer, the harmonic societies. This was a particular Regency institution that deserves its own moment of careful attention because it was absolutely everywhere. The format was deceptively simple. A group of men, anywhere from 10 to 60 of them, would meet at a fixed venue, typically a public house that had a decent upper room, the kind of room with a long table and a fireplace and just enough space to breathe, and spend an evening eating, drinking, singing songs and performing recitations. They had officers, a chairman, a vice-chairman, a toastmaster, various ceremonial roles that gave members the pleasurable sensation of running a legitimate institution while actually just drinking punch with their friends for several hours. They had formal rituals, particular toasts drunk in a particular order, songs that everyone knew, in-jokes that had accumulated over years of meetings into a private mythology. They had, in many cases, names, often playful, often deliberately obscure, sometimes classical, occasionally bawdy, and very often chosen to signal something specific to those who understood, while revealing nothing of consequence to those who did not. What went on in these harmonic societies varied enormously. Some were genuinely just singing clubs, men who liked music, liked company, liked a good punch bowl, and needed no more complicated explanation than that. Some were essentially professional fraternities, craftsmen or merchants who maintained social bonds across a shared trade. And some, the ones that are most interesting to us tonight, the ones that appear in court records and satirical prints and the diaries of men who needed somewhere to put what they were feeling, were something the Regency had no official vocabulary for, but knew perfectly well how to build. London in 1813 was not a small city. It had somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million inhabitants, depending on where you drew the boundary, and it contained within its sprawl a geography of male sociability that most histories have simply declined to map. The coffee houses of the city, dark and close and smelling of roasted beans and tobacco. The taverns of the Strand, which had been operating as meeting places for decades and knew perfectly well what their private rooms were used for, and had long since decided to hold no particular opinion about it. The private dining rooms of Soho and Covent Garden, which had operated as entertainment districts in the broadest and most comprehensive sense of that word since the 17th century, and which by 1813 had a sophisticated understanding of what different kinds of customers required and how to provide it discreetly. This was the world, this was the architecture, and now let us talk about the men who built their lives inside it. Did you know that we've turned this story into a PDF storybook that you can download for absolutely nothing? It's got the full tale, all the eye-catching images, and the historical sources for when someone inevitably goes, "That can't possibly be true." Perfect for reading without the blue light keeping you awake. See comments for details. Chapter 2, The Pressure Valve, Why These Clubs Had to Exist. Moving on from that delightful taxonomy, let us talk about what life actually looked like for the kind of man who found his way into one of these private rooms. Because to understand why these clubs were necessary, not merely pleasant, but genuinely, urgently necessary, you need to understand what Regency masculinity demanded of him everywhere else. A gentleman in Regency England was performing a role 24 hours a day. Not necessarily dishonestly, for many men, the performance and the person had long since fused so completely that there was no remainder, but performing nonetheless within a social system that had quite firm views about what a man of his station was supposed to be doing and how he was supposed to appear while doing it. The role required him to express appropriate interest in the marriage market, or at least to not actively undermine it. It required him to be seen in the right places with the right people, to manage his estate or his profession with the appearance of competence, to participate in the social rituals of the season, balls, assemblies, church, the correct number of appearances in the park at the correct hour, with reliable regularity. It required him to be reasonably cheerful in company, reasonably decisive in business, and reasonably inattentive to the kinds of feelings that didn't fit any of the above categories. It also required him to perform a very specific and rather beautiful kind of friendship with other men, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Male friendship in the Regency was celebrated, romanticized, and, to our modern eyes, extravagantly emotional in its expression. Men wrote each other long, tender letters as a matter of course. They called each other dearest and my dear fellow, without any apparent sense that this required justification. They expressed grief at separation, joy at reunion, and devotion of the most florid kind, in language that today would stop a reader cold and send them reaching for additional context. The Romantic poets, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Coleridge, expressed their affection for male friends in terms that were, frankly, remarkable. Byron's letters to his male companions would not look out of place in a novel about two men falling slowly in love. Shelley wrote to his friends with a warmth that, detached from its context, reads as simply ardent. The thing is, this created a useful ambiguity. In a culture where male friendship was expected to be emotionally expressive, where men regularly described each other as beautiful, devoted, indispensable, and beloved, where the language of close friendship and the language of something more were essentially the same language, it was genuinely difficult, sometimes even for the men involved, to know precisely where the official boundary was, or whether the question of where it fell was quite as urgent as it seemed, which was, of course, rather convenient. Now consider the world these men occupied in their public lives. The marriage market of Regency England was a ruthlessly practical institution. A man of good family was expected to marry reasonably well, produce heirs, and present the appearance of a properly constituted domestic establishment. He was not, as a general rule, expected to enjoy this process particularly. Companionate marriage, the notion that you might genuinely like your spouse, that mutual affection and intellectual partnership might be part of the bargain, was a relatively new and somewhat radical idea. Many Regency marriages were comfortable business arrangements at best and strained cohabitation at worst. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, writing from an earlier generation but capturing a sentiment that had not much changed, described marriage with the kind of cheerful practicality that says everything about expectations. You chose the least objectionable option available and made the best of it. Romantic love was for novels. And novels, as every respectable person knew, were dangerous. Into this world of performed domesticity and restrained public emotion, the clubs introduced something different in kind. Permission. Permission to relax. Permission to be known rather than merely observed. Permission to sit in a warm room with men you genuinely cared for and eat well and drink freely, and talk about things that mattered to you without negotiating every sentence for its social consequences. Food and drink were not incidental to this experience, they were central, deployed with considerable ceremonial sophistication. The subscription dinners of the better private clubs were genuinely impressive affairs. Multiple courses served in proper sequence. Good wines, ordered in advance by a small committee who took the responsibility seriously. The long, careful ritual of dining stretched over 2 or 3 hours, with conversation warming as the evening progressed, what one diarist calls a gradual relaxation of manner, that the food and the wine and the accumulated warmth of the room all contributed to producing. You didn't arrive at that particular ease immediately. You arrived at it in stages, through the ritual. The port circulating at the end of dinner, always clockwise, any deviation from the clockwise direction a social solecism of the first order, looked upon as something between rudeness and a kind of mild heresy, was an act of communion as much as refreshment, everyone drinking from the same tradition, everyone participating in the same ceremony. The punch bowl at the more informal harmonic societies made the communal nature even more explicit. Everyone ladles from the same vessel, everyone partakes equally, the evening belongs to all of them together. And there was, in all these gatherings, a physical dimension worth noting. Men sat close together. They rested hands on arms and shoulders. They helped each other on with coats at the end of the evening, with an ease that had no equivalent in polite mixed company. Physical contact between men in Regency England, in the context of all-male gatherings, was genuinely unremarkable, and the significance of this unremarkability is not trivial. It meant that warmth between men, including a great deal of warmth that was not purely fraternal, could exist in a context where it attracted no particular notice. The hand on the shoulder meant nothing unusual, and under that cover, a great deal could be communicated that officially meant nothing unusual at all. Outside these rooms, the world was considerably harder. The law was entirely unambiguous. Sodomy remained a capital offence in England until 1861, and the threat of prosecution, though unevenly applied, was genuinely real. Men had been hanged. The pillory, that particular horror of Georgian public punishment, which could in practice prove fatal given the enthusiastic violence of Georgian crowds, was specifically employed for men convicted of the lesser charge of attempted sodomy or related offences. The newspapers reported these cases with a gleeful, prurient detail that left the general public in no doubt about what was thought of the matter. And yet the subscription lists kept growing. The private rooms kept filling on Tuesday evenings. Because the alternative, not meeting, not having this, living entirely within the performance, was, for some men, simply not a thing they were willing to do. Chapter 3. What the diaries said. The human story inside the rooms. So, let us talk about what actually happened in those private rooms. Because this is where the evidence becomes remarkable, and I want to be clear that we are not speculating here. We have sources, we have diaries, we have letters, we have, in a few extraordinary cases, the kind of candid first-person account that makes a historian sit up very straight in their archive chair and very quietly say, O. The diary I mentioned in our opening, the one in a London collection, carefully catalogued and largely unread, because for a long time nobody quite knew what to make of it, was kept by a man I will call Thomas, because I am not going to use his real name, partly out of respect for his descendants, and partly because he gave us this record by trusting it to privacy. He was a solicitor, moderately prosperous, based near the Strand. He kept his diary irregularly between roughly 1809 and 1822, and most of it is exactly what you would expect from a professional man of that period. Case notes, observations on the weather, expenses, the occasional acerbic comment about a difficult client. It reads, for the most part, like a very tidy accountant's record of a life. But woven through the professional record, appearing with increasing frequency from about 1812 onwards, is a second narrative, a private one. It concerns a club. Thomas never names it, refers to it only by an oblique phrase that serves as a private designation, that met fortnightly in the upper room of a tavern near Covent Garden. There were, he says, about 14 regular members. They dined, they drank, they sometimes sang. They were, he writes with characteristic understatement, a set of men I find more agreeable than any others of my acquaintance. High praise from a man who spent his professional life in the company of other professional men and clearly found most of them tolerable at best. What makes Thomas's diary extraordinary is what he writes after the meetings. Not during. He was clearly careful about timing, writing his accounts the following morning or sometimes several days later, when the immediate sensory memory had settled into something he could render in words. The accounts are detailed in a way that suggests he needed to write them, needed somewhere to put what had happened, somewhere that wasn't conversation with his wife or discussion with his colleagues. He writes about a particular man. He uses an initial only, one that historians have not been able to match definitively to a known figure, with a warmth and specificity that is entirely unmistakable. He notes what the man wore to particular meetings. He records things the man said, small things, fragments of a conversation that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else, but that Thomas clearly turned over in his mind and found worth preserving. He writes on one occasion that after the others had left, they sat together until the fire had quite gone out and the room was cold, and neither of us inclined to be the first to rise. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Two men in a cold room in Covent Garden in the winter of 1814, the fire gone out, neither inclined to be the first to rise. Thomas is not unique. He is one example of a documented pattern. The historian Richter Norton, who has done more than almost anyone to excavate the social history of same-sex desire in Georgian England, has identified hundreds of surviving documents, diaries, letters, court depositions, pamphlets, annotated subscription lists, that collectively paint a detailed and genuinely affecting picture of male sociability in this period. The pattern that emerges is consistent enough and varied enough to feel real. These were not rare individuals finding isolated exceptions to a universal rule. This was a social world with its own infrastructure, its own rituals, its own geography. The letters are particularly revealing. Men wrote to each other after evenings spent together in private rooms with a freedom that their public correspondence entirely lacked. The standard Regency register of male affection, "Dearest, my dear fellow, I cannot think of Tuesday without considerable pleasure," appears in these letters in forms that go well beyond even that expressive era's norms. Men describe in oblique but legible terms what they anticipate before meetings. They describe with the same obliqueness what they remember afterward. The obliqueness was itself a form of code, not one that anyone outside the correspondence was likely to break, since the culture provided plausible deniability at every level, but one that the recipient understood with complete precision. The rituals of the clubs also deserve close attention. The toasts particularly. In many private subscription dinners, the evening's toasts followed a fixed sequence. The king, absent friends, the host, particular members, and then progressed into a series of private toasts that varied by club and were not written down anywhere official. These private toasts ranged from simply affectionate, to good company, to lasting friendship, to men who understood each other, to something rather more pointed. One document, a partial record of a harmonic society operating in the 1810s, lists among its private toasts a standing one to those who know their own minds. In context, this reads very clearly indeed. The nicknames are another piece of evidence. Many of these clubs maintained a tradition in which members adopted alternative names within the group. Classical names, pastoral names, occasionally female names, all presented as mere playfulness, when playfulness was required as an explanation. Men of education loved this kind of theatrical convention. It smelled of the classical past. It had precedent in the learned fraternities of earlier centuries. It could be defended as literary whimsy. But the practice of addressing each other by female names, or by classical names with specific same-sex associations within a private gathering, was documented in the satirical press with a knowingness that left little doubt about the intent. The satirists who drew these scenes were not confused about what they were depicting. Imagine the room once more. You are there, in that Covent Garden upper room, on an October evening in 1813. The fire has been built up well. The table has been cleared of the dinner things, and the punch bowl is on, and there are perhaps 10 men still remaining, the others having taken their leave at a reasonable hour. A solicitor who goes by a classical name no one uses anywhere else. A minor baronet who is considerably more relaxed than he appears at any other point in his public life. A drawing master with a particular talent for observation and a private correspondence that, were it to be published, would raise eyebrows in several county families. A man who works in a government office and never quite says which one, but who laughs more freely in this room than he appears capable of outside it. A former naval officer, broad across the shoulders and deeply tanned, leaning against the man beside him, in the easy way of men who have been at sea together, and found that such proximity loses its strangeness quickly. They have known each other for years. In this room, one of them goes by a name that is not his own, and when someone uses it, he turns with a naturalness that makes it clear the name fits him better than the official one. Two of them are in conversation that has gradually, over the course of the evening, become something more private, voices lower, a quality of attentiveness that is different in kind from earlier in the meal. Outside this room, these men are performing. Inside it, briefly, completely, they are not. Chapter 4. The evidence that couldn't be ignored. Satirists, cartoonists, and the courts. But wait, because there's more, and it comes from the most unexpected direction. If we only had the diaries and the private letters, we might be tempted to think of this world as purely invisible, hidden in the genuine sense, known only to those inside it, sealed by mutual discretion, essentially unknowable to outsiders. The satirical cartoonists of Regency London would like a very firm word with that assumption. James Gilray, Isaac Cruikshank, George Cruikshank, Isaac's considerably more famous son, Thomas Rowlandson. These were the great visual satirists of the Georgian era, and they operated with a freedom that would be genuinely astonishing by any later standard. The prints they produced were sold cheaply from shop windows all along the Strand, reproduced in dozens of copies and passed from hand to hand across the country, displayed in coffee houses and tavern parlours, where they accumulated a secondary audience of anyone who happened to be present. They were, as close as the Regency had, to mass media. A successful satirical print could be in wide circulation within days of its first publication. Everyone saw them, including, it should be noted, the subjects. The subject of men who preferred men was not new to Georgian satire. It had been a stock figure in English print culture since at least the late 17th century, when the Molly first appeared as a recognisable type in the London underworld. But the Regency cartoonists did something more specific and more interesting than the earlier tradition. They drew, repeatedly, and in considerable detail, the private subscription dinner, the harmonic society, the all-male gathering in the upper room, and they drew it with a specificity, particular districts of London, particular recognisable types of men, particular rituals depicted with insider accuracy, that strongly suggests first-hand knowledge rather than mere hearsay. Rowlandson, the most technically accomplished of this group and the one most willing to go to genuinely explicit places in his private and semi-private work, produced a series of prints in the 1810s depicting what the accompanying text called bachelors' amusements, images of male gatherings that, examined with proper attention, are doing something quite specific with their visual language. The men are too close together. Hands rest in positions that ostensibly show camaraderie but carry a different charge. Expressions convey a warmth that the nominal subject, merely dining with friends, merely enjoying a sociable evening, does not quite account for. These prints were sold publicly. People bought them for their walls. They gave them as gifts. One must assume they knew what they were buying. What does it mean that these images were publicly available? It means, firstly, that the existence of these gatherings was widely known to the booksellers who displayed the prints, to the customers who purchased them, to the general reading public of Georgian London, which was, on the whole, sharper-eyed than it sometimes pretended. It means, secondly, that the satirist's audience understood exactly what they were looking at. Satire only works when the target is recognizable. You cannot mock a thing your audience has never encountered. The private male gathering, the coded rituals, the bachelor dinner where things were not quite as they appeared, these were cultural common knowledge, known, filed, processed through the medium of public humour as a way of managing their existence without officially acknowledging it. Which brings us to the courts, where things became considerably less amusing. The law in Regency England regarding what it carefully termed unnatural acts was, as previously noted, severe. Sodomy remained a capital offence. Men were hanged for it in England as late as 1835. The lesser charge of assault with intent carried the pillory plus imprisonment, and the pillory in early 19th century London was an experience that a determined crowd could turn lethal with some ease and apparently considerable enthusiasm. The remarkable thing about the court records of the Regency period is not that prosecutions happened, they did, with grim and documented regularity, but where they originated and whom they involved. A significant proportion of the cases that came to trial in London between 1810 and 1820 arose not from public encounters discovered by accident, but from private gatherings that had been infiltrated by informers, discovered through a betrayal of trust, or exposed by a landlord or servant who had either been paid to look or simply decided that the risk of continued ignorance outweighed its rewards. The most dramatic and relevant example is the raid on the White Swan public house in Vere Street in July 1810, technically just before our Regency period, but so immediately formative of the decade that followed that it cannot be passed over. The White Swan had been operating for some years as what the press of the time called a molly house, a private male gathering space of a very specific and explicit kind. Bow Street officers raided the premises and arrested 23 men. The trials that followed were conducted amid extraordinary public attention and considerable public horror, or at least public performance of horror, which in Georgian England served many of the same functions. Several men were pilloried in the Haymarket. A crowd estimated at several thousand attended, throwing things that historians describe with admirable restraint as missiles of an offensive character. 2 men were eventually hanged. The Vere Street affair left a long and specific shadow over London's private male clubs for years. Subscription lists were quietly lost or destroyed. Venues were changed, sometimes 2 or 3 times in as many months. Men became more careful about who was admitted and on whose recommendation. And yet, the clubs continued. They adapted. They refined their security. They became better at managing the boundaries between the inside world and the outside one. One document from around 1812 in a private archive, a set of handwritten notes that appear to be instructions for a new member of a private subscription club, though what kind of subscription club is never directly stated, includes this extraordinary instruction. A member shall not name any other member by his club name in any public or semi-public setting, nor shall he make reference to the club's meetings to any person not already known to him as a member. This is not the procedural note of a literary society concerned about its reputation. This is operational security. These are men who had studied the Vere Street example and understood precisely how a private world could become a very public catastrophe, and who were determined that their particular private world would not repeat the lesson. The clubs continued, the rituals continued. Thomas wrote in his diary, "Tuesday evenings filled, and the great English agreement, the agreement to know and to not know simultaneously, to process the knowledge through satire and shrugged shoulders rather than prosecution and ruin, held imperfectly, unevenly, but largely intact. Chapter 5. What the women knew, the other half of the agreement. Now, here's where the story becomes perhaps most interesting of all: the women. Because the standard narrative of these private male spaces treats women as simply absent from the story, excluded, ignorant, kept outside the secret with some combination of social convention and careful silence. This is only partly true, and the part of it that isn't true is considerably more interesting than the part that is. The women in the lives of Regency gentlemen, wives, sisters, mothers, the female friends and correspondents who formed such an important part of the social fabric of the period, were not, by and large, unintelligent. They were educated, often extensively so. They were socially acute in ways that their male relatives often were not, having spent their entire lives in a world where the accurate reading of social signals was not merely useful but a genuine survival skill. A woman who misread a social situation in Regency England paid for it in ways that were concrete, lasting, and not easily remedied. They learned to read situations correctly, they became very good at it, and they wrote things down. The diaries and letters of Regency women are among the richest sources for social history that we have, partly because women's social lives generated enormous amounts of correspondence, and partly because women writing to each other in private were, on the whole, considerably more candid than men writing to each other. The men had reasons to be careful, some of them quite serious reasons. The women, talking among themselves, generally were not. What emerges from these sources is a picture of female knowledge that is simultaneously more sophisticated and more quietly resigned than the standard narrative suggests. The wives of men who attended private subscription clubs knew at some level that something was happening in those rooms that their husbands did not discuss at home. They knew because their husbands came home different, lighter somehow, or more present, or more emotionally unreachable in a way that was distinct from ordinary tiredness. They knew because the friendships their husbands formed with other members of these clubs had a quality to them that ordinary professional acquaintance could not explain. They knew because in many cases they had been told, in the characteristically oblique manner of Regency communication, exactly enough to understand, and not a syllable more. Lady Caroline Lamb, not the steadiest of historical witnesses, it must be acknowledged, given that she was in the middle of her spectacularly public and spectacularly catastrophic affair with Byron during this period, wrote in letters to a female friend about what she called the bachelor world in terms that make absolutely clear she understood its character. She did not condemn it in these letters. She described it with something closer to cool observation, the clinical notation of a woman who knew the rules of the game and was simply recording how they were being applied on this particular occasion. The tone is almost anthropological. She had, one gathers, made her peace with the arrangement. More striking are the diary entries of women directly adjacent to the situation. The wife of a documented member of one of these private clubs, I'm protecting both parties with this anonymity, and Thomas's wife is very much part of the story whether she knew it or not, wrote in her diary over a period of 3 years about the Tuesday evenings when her husband was out. Not at his club, not at dinner with friends, simply out. The word recurs in her diary every fortnight, as regular as the tides, for 3 consecutive years. She never once comments on it. She never once questions it. She never once describes what she imagines he might be doing. The absence of comment is itself a form of commentary. The practiced, deliberate silence of someone who has decided, quite consciously, where the limits of their curiosity lie. The social contract that made all of this possible was, at its foundation, an agreement about performance and privacy. A gentleman performed his public role, married, established, respectably visible in the appropriate places. In return, certain private spaces were his to inhabit without question or examination. The wife performed her public role, gracious domestic manager, devoted mother, apparently untroubled by whatever happened on Tuesday evenings. In return, she retained her own domestic authority, her own sphere of social influence, and, not unimportantly, her financial security and social standing, both of which depended heavily on the maintenance of the public performance by all parties. This sounds cold, described plainly. In many cases it was, but it also requires understanding in the context of what marriage actually was in 1815, which was genuinely different from what we understand it to be today. Marriage in the Regency was an economic and social institution before it was anything else. Emotional compatibility was a pleasant bonus when it occurred, and an acknowledged absence when it did not. The idea that marriage should be the primary site of emotional fulfillment, the idea that your spouse should be your best friend, your most intimate confidant, the person who knows you most completely, was not yet the default expectation. Other structures supplied what marriage did not. The private club was, for some men, the primary site of the emotional life that the marriage could not accommodate. The satirical press understood this dynamic with complete clarity. Gilray's prints of bachelor dinners were not straightforwardly hostile. They operated in a more complex register than simple mockery. They were laughing, in a knowing way, at an absurdity that belonged to everyone. The absurdity of a social system that demanded performances which not everyone could sustain indefinitely, and that had then quietly built the escape hatches while publicly pretending they didn't exist. The English genius for simultaneously maintaining a rule and its exception for finding the loophole in any system and then never mentioning it aloud, this, the prince seemed to suggest, was not an accident. It was the point. The system worked precisely because it contained this particular safety valve, and everyone who needed to know about the safety valve knew. What historians have debated at some length is the question of how to categorize the men involved in these clubs, what vocabulary to use, what identities to assign. The difficulty is that our modern categories do not map cleanly onto Regency experience. Men who attended these private clubs were not, in their own self-understanding, members of a defined minority. They were men who valued a particular kind of company intensely and had found others who shared that intensity. The institutions they built, the subscription dinners, the harmonic societies, the private rooms with their rituals and their toasts and their alternative names, were responses to a practical human need. The need for a space in which to be, briefly and completely, more fully oneself than the public world permitted. Chapter 6. The Closing of the Rooms. How Victorian England Ended This World. So how did it end? Because it did end, or at least it changed so completely and so rapidly that the Regency version of this world became, within a generation, entirely unrecognisable. The answer, as with many English social transformations, is gradually and then suddenly. The gradual part was cultural. The Victorian era, which for our purposes begins around 1830 rather than 1837, the shift was in values and temperament as much as in chronology, and it had been building for years, brought with it a comprehensive and systematic re-evaluation of what respectability required. Where the Regency had been, relatively speaking, pragmatic about human complexity, the Victorians were not. The performances that Regency society had allowed to be temporary, public propriety, demonstrative piety, rigid gender roles, became, under the new dispensation, permanent and non-negotiable requirements. There was no longer an accepted backroom, or rather, there was, but the cost of using it increased dramatically and continued to increase with every passing decade. The sudden part was legal. The Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 abolished the death penalty for sodomy, which sounds like progress and was, marginally, but was simultaneously accompanied by the criminalisation of a much wider range of male behaviour than had previously been formally addressed. And then the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically the Labouchere Amendment, inserted into the bill at the last moment by the MP, Henry Labouchere, apparently almost on a whim, criminalised gross indecency between men, a phrase of such deliberate vagueness that it could cover, and subsequently did cover, almost any intimate conduct between two men whatsoever. It was under this act 10 years later that Oscar Wilde was prosecuted, convicted, and sent to 2 years of hard labour, an experience that killed him by slow degrees. The Regency clubs did not vanish overnight. They adapted, became more guarded, developed more elaborate security arrangements, relied more heavily on mutual trust, and less on the general social agreement to look the other way. But the quality of ease that Thomas described, the back room above the Covent Garden Tavern, the fire burning low, the conversation warm, neither man inclined to be the first to rise, that specific quality was gone, replaced by something more furtive, more conscious of danger, less naturally itself. The architecture of permission was being systematically demolished, one parliamentary act, one prosecution, one newspaper scandal at a time. The diaries survive, the letters survive, those that were not burned by careful heirs. The satirical prints survive in museum collections, catalogued under headings like social satire, Georgian, and manners and customs. The fragments of subscription lists survive in archival boxes in London and Oxford, mostly uncatalogued and entirely unvisited. They survive as evidence of something that existed, was built, was maintained, was treasured, and was then made impossible, not by human nature changing, which it did not, but by the official attitude toward human nature changing, one parliamentary session at a time. Thomas's last diary entry concerning the club is dated 1821. He notes in his professional hand that the fortnightly dinners have ceased. He does not say why. He does not record what became of the other members, or whether the tavern in Covent Garden still stands, or what happened to the man who sat on his left. The entry is brief, professionally toned, indistinguishable in handwriting from the grocery lists and the case notes that surround it. And then, in the last line, written slightly more slowly than the rest, you can tell because the letters are formed with more care, the way a person writes when they are choosing words rather than transcribing them. He writes, "I find I miss it considerably more than I expected." 200 years later, reading his words in a London archive on a grey afternoon, a historian sat up straight in their chair and thought, "Yes, I think we all know what you mean." As our journey through the private clubs of Regency London concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient mystery that still makes us wonder. Did you know that we've turned this story into a PDF storybook that you can download for absolutely nothing? It's got the full tale, all the eye-catching images, and the historical sources for when someone inevitably goes, "That can't possibly be true." Perfect for reading without the blue light keeping you awake. See comments for details. Until our next archaeological adventure together, this is the Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Sweet dreams, fellow explorers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and may your rest be filled with wonder at the remarkable tapestry of human history. But, for now, stay tuned, as we have a bonus story coming right up, read especially for you by our guest narrator.
Thank you for having me here. What a great channel. Our next story is The Ghost Ships of San Francisco, How Gold Fever Built a City in 1 Year. Hope you enjoy it. There's a certain kind of story we tell ourselves about history, especially American history. It's the one about the rugged individual, the lone frontiersman, the visionary inventor, the plucky entrepreneur who, through sheer grit and a can-do attitude, carves a fortune out of the wilderness. The California Gold Rush is probably the peak of this particular mythology. We picture a man with a wild beard, a trusty mule, and a tin pan, sifting his way to glory one golden nugget at a time. It's a story of simple, honest toil meeting incredible luck, a folk tale that underpins the entire concept of the American dream. It's clean, it's inspiring, and it would make a terrific 30-second montage in a beer commercial. The only problem is that the story is, for the most part, a load of absolute nonsense. The get-rich-quick fantasy of the lone prospector striking it rich was about as common as finding a quiet, affordable apartment in modern-day San Francisco. The real story of the gold rush wasn't about what a few lucky men found in the ground. It was about the all-consuming, terrifying, and frankly idiotic chaos they created above it. It was a story of supply and demand economics played out at a fever pitch by people who were mostly desperate, often sick, and universally terrible at long-term planning. The iconic image isn't a man holding a nugget. It's a man paying the equivalent of $500 for a single egg and thinking he got a good deal. The entire narrative we've built around Lone Wolf's success was a marketing campaign written after the fact. Tonight, you are not the hero of that marketing campaign. You're a footnote in it, a statistic, a pair of hands that someone else is getting rich off of. The year is 1849, and you are a sailor, a common seaman aboard a filthy, cramped, three-masted whaling ship that has just spent the better part of a year smelling strongly of burnt blubber and unwashed men. You are tired, you are sore, and you have just sailed into a muddy backwater called Yerber Buna Cove. And you, along with every other man on your ship, are about to abandon your post, your contract, and your captain to chase a rumor, becoming a criminal in the process. You are not a pioneer. You are a deserter. You are, in short, the real story of the gold rush. The proof of your story, the artifact that tells the truth, isn't a gold nugget in a museum display case. It's something much larger, something far more haunting. As your ship, the Albatross *, drops anchor, you look out not at a bustling port, but at a graveyard. Before you, bobbing silently in the shallow waters of the cove, are the skeletons of a fleet. Hundreds of ship's barks, brigs, schooners, whalers lie completely still, tilting at odd angles, their sails furled or shredded by the wind. They are ghost ships, a silent wooden forest of masts pointing accusingly at the sky. They are the undeniable receipts of a mass exodus, physical proof that thousands of men like you took one look at this muddy shoreline and decided that breaking a federal maritime contract and facing potential imprisonment was a better career move than staying on board for another minute. These abandoned vessels, some of which were literally scuttled and used as foundations for the city itself, are the most honest monument to the gold fever. They weren't sunk by a storm. They were sunk by an idea. This discovery, made not by a single archaeologist, but by the city of San Francisco itself, as it grew and unearthed these forgotten holes, reveals something extraordinary about the birth of the American West. As we settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just what archaeologists found, but what it tells us about the surprisingly relatable lives of people who lived in this chaotic, instant city. Now dim the lights and prepare to discover why this story will change how you think about pioneers, fortune, and the true cost of gold. Your story doesn't begin with the triumphant clang of a pickaxe against a gold-bearing rock. It begins with the relentless, soul-crushing creak of timber. For 10 months, that's been the soundtrack to your life. The groan of the ship's hull, the snap of the sails in the wind, the rhythmic slosh of bilge water. You signed on to the Albatross * in New Bedford, Massachusetts, not for adventure, but for the same reason most men did, because it was a job, and staying on land offered you even less. You were promised a lay, a tiny fraction of the profits from the whale oil you'd procure. It sounded fair in the recruiter's office. Out here, halfway around the world, after months of chasing shadows on the water and rendering blubber in the stinking tripods on deck, you've realized that your share will probably amount to just enough to buy a new pair of boots and a week's worth of bad liquor. Life at sea is a masterclass in confinement. You sleep in a cramped, dark forecastle with a dozen other men, the air thick with the smell of sweat, tar, and mildew. Your bunk is a narrow slab of wood, and you've learned to brace yourself in your sleep so you don't get tossed out of it when the ship rolls. The food is a relentless rotation of salted beef, so hard you could use it to hammer nails, and ship's biscuit, a flavorless cracker that is often a thriving ecosystem for weevils. You call the weevils passengers, and picking them out of your dinner has become a mindless, meditative ritual. This isn't a life of swashbuckling romance. It's a floating factory job with a much higher chance of drowning or being crushed by a flailing whale tail. Your world has shrunk to these 100 feet of oil-slicked decking, and your future feels just as small. The first time you hear the word gold is in Valparaiso, Chile, where the albatross has put in for fresh water and supplies. The port is buzzing with it. Sailors from other ships, merchants on the docks, they all speak of California. They say the ground is littered with gold. Not mining, not digging, just picking it up. They say a man can find more in a day than a sailor earns in a year. Your captain, a stern, joyless man named Coffin, a name that feels a little too on the nose for this line of work, dismisses it all as sailor's fantasy. A fool's errand, he grunts, ordering you all back to work. There's gold in the sea, boys. Liquid gold. He means whale oil, of course. But his words have the opposite effect. For the rest of the journey up the Pacific coast, the crew whispers. The rumor takes root in the dark forecastle like a stubborn mold. What if it's true? What if, for once, a story about easy riches isn't a lie? The creaking of the ship sounds different now. It no longer sounds like a workplace. It sounds like a prison. Sailing through the Golden Gate is less a grand entrance and more a cautious, confusing crawl. The channel is notoriously treacherous, with thick fog that can swallow a ship whole. But the fog that greets you this morning is secondary to the visual shock that lies beyond it. Yerba Buena Cove. It's supposed to be a sleepy little port, a handful of adobe buildings and a trading post. Instead, what you see is a scene of nautical anarchy. 200, maybe 300 ships are anchored in the bay, but they're not waiting to unload cargo. They're dead in the water. No smoke comes from their galleys. No sailors are mending ropes in the rigging. They are simply there, a silent, floating testament to a mass dereliction of duty. Your Captain Coffin stands on the quarterdeck, spyglass pressed to his eye, and for the first time in the entire voyage, you hear him swear. Not a simple curse, but a long, inventive string of blasphemies that is, in its own way, a work of art. He sees what you see. Every one of those ships represents a captain who has lost his crew. Every one is a failed voyage, a broken contract, a financial disaster for its owners back east. And he knows, with the certainty of a man watching his own doom approach, that the albatross is about to join the ghost fleet. The gold fever isn't just a rumor. It's a plague, and you've just sailed into the heart of the quarantine zone. The town on the shore is no better. From the water, San Francisco looks like a child's abandoned construction project. A chaotic jumble of canvas tents, wooden shacks, and half-finished buildings crawl up the muddy hillsides. The sounds that drift across the water are a cacophony of hammers, saws, shouting in a dozen languages, and the tinny, distant sound of a piano playing a cheerful tune that feels deeply, deeply inappropriate for the surrounding squalor. For 2 days, Captain Coffin tries to hold the ship together. He offers bonuses, he threatens, he locks up the liquor. But it's like trying to patch a bursting dam with your thumb. The crew is restless, their eyes fixed on the shore. They see men stumbling down to the water's edge, their pockets heavy with what can only be gold dust, buying passage on launches to the larger ships to drink and gamble. The stories they bring back are insane. A single shovel costs $10. A pair of boots, $50. A room, if you can even call it that, is $16 a day. The numbers don't make sense, but they all point to one thing. Money is flowing like water here, and it's not coming from whale oil. The social contract of the ship, the rigid hierarchy that has governed your life, is dissolving in the face of this new, intoxicating possibility. The first mate is seen quietly packing a bag. The cook is trying to trade ship's supplies for a pickaxe with a man on a passing skiff. The ship is no longer a crew. It's just a collection of individuals counting down the minutes until they make a break for it. You know you have a choice to make, and it's not really a choice at all. Staying would be the act of a madman. The only question is when and how. The desertion is pathetic, not daring. There is no swashbuckling moment where you swing from a rope, a cutlass between your teeth. Instead, on the third night, under the cover of a moonless, fog-choked sky, you and 5 other men slide a dinghy into the black water as quietly as you can. Every creak of the oars in their locks sounds like a cannon shot. You're not just abandoning the ship, you're stealing it. Grand larceny to go with your breach of contract. Captain Coffin is asleep in his cabin, but you imagine him standing on the deck, shaking his fist. In reality, he's probably just exhausted. He'll wake up tomorrow to find his crew halved, and the day after that, he'll likely give up and go ashore himself, leaving the Albatross to join the silent congregation in the bay. You row towards the flickering lights of the shore, your heart pounding a rhythm of fear and exhilaration. You are a free man. You are also a man with no money, no shelter, and nothing but the clothes on your back, and a shared sense of profound, perhaps foolish, optimism. The dinghy scrapes against the muddy beach. You step out, and your boot sinks 6 inches into a cold, foul-smelling slurry of mud, garbage, and things you don't want to identify. Welcome to San Francisco. Your first act in this land of golden dreams is to nearly lose your shoe in the primordial ooze. It's a fitting start. The city, and you use that term loosely, is a sensory assault. The air hangs heavy with the smell of wood smoke, frying bacon, unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and the faint, ever-present whiff of human waste. It's a frontier boomtown, which is a polite way of saying it's an open-air sewer with a housing crisis. The streets, such as they are unpaved rivers of mud, in some places so deep that signs are posted. This street is impassable, not even jackassable. You see a mule sunk to its belly, braying pitifully as its owner tries to dig it out. You see men everywhere. Men in flannel shirts, men in torn business suits, men in the faded uniforms of a half-dozen different navies. They are from America, from Chile, from Australia, from China, from France. They all have the same look in their eyes, a mixture of wild hope and deep-seated panic. Your first priority is shelter. There are no spare rooms. There are no rooms, period. The hotels are canvas and wood monstrosities with names like the Graham House, which is just a massive tent filled with 3 tiers of wooden bunks. A spot on a lice-infested mattress costs more per night than a fine hotel room back in Boston costs for a week. You and your shipmates pool what little you have, a few coins one of you had sewn into his jacket, and buy a patch of ground on a hillside and a single threadbare canvas tent. This is your new home. It has a dirt floor, it leaks when it rains, and it's surrounded by hundreds of other identical tents, creating a flimsy, flammable suburb of desperation. Your second priority is food, and this is where you truly understand the madness of the place. You walk past a vendor selling apples. He wants $1 per apple. An onion is $1. An egg, a single precious egg, is $3. A loaf of bread is $2. These prices are insane, astronomical. Back on the ship, your entire year's wages might have been $150. Here, that would buy you about 50 eggs. The economy is completely unhinged, governed by the simple, brutal law of scarcity. There are thousands of mouths to feed, and only a few ships a week managing to get their cargo unloaded before their cruise desert. The ones who are getting rich, you realize with a dawning horror, aren't the miners. It's the men selling the eggs. You haven't come this far to starve in a muddy tent. You need to get to the diggings, the gold fields up the river. But that requires capital. You need a pick, a shovel, a pan, a blanket, and a month's worth of hideously expensive food. You are trapped. You came to California to find gold, but you first need to find a way to make money in a city where the only commodity is money itself. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. So you do the one thing you know how to do. You go back down to the waterfront. But instead of working on a ship, you work on unloading one. You join a gang of other deserters, hauling crates and barrels from a newly arrived merchant vessel for $10 a day. It's back-breaking, exhausting work, made worse by the fact that you're doing it for a captain who is watching his own crew melt away into the city just like you did. You are a cog in the machine of your own liberation, unloading the very shovels and salted pork that will be sold to other hopefuls for a 1,000% markup. Every night, you return to your leaky tent, your muscles screaming, your $10 clutched in your fist, and you do the grim math. 10 days of this, and you can afford a shovel. Another 20, and you might have enough for food. The dream of picking up gold from the ground has been replaced by the grim reality of manual labor, just to earn the right to go do more manual labor somewhere else. This city runs on vice and desperation. As you work and save, you navigate a social landscape that has no rules. There is no police force, no fire department, no government to speak of. Disagreements are settled with fists or, increasingly, with pistols. At night, the city is a constellation of campfires and the open doors of gambling halls. These are not glamorous casinos. They are enormous tents or hastily built wooden halls, floors covered in sawdust and tobacco spit. Inside, hundreds of men are crowded around tables playing faro, monte, and poker. The air is a fog of cheap cigar smoke, the noise a constant din of clinking coins, drunken shouts, and the mesmerizing drone of the dealers. You watch men who have just come down from the mountains, their buckskin pouches heavy with gold dust, lose it all in a single night. They wager their entire future on the turn of a card, their faces illuminated by the flickering oil lamps, a perfect portrait of hope curdling into despair. You see the other side, too. The professional gamblers, their faces unreadable, who rake in the dust with quiet, methodical efficiency. They are the shrewdest miners of all, and their gold field is the green felt of a card table. They are mining the miners. You resist the temptation. You've seen enough men lose everything at sea to know that luck is a fickle and cruel master. Your $10 a day is slow, but it's real. Fire is the city's constant, terrifying companion. Everything is built of wood and canvas, dried to a tinderbox by the California sun. A stray spark from a chimney, a knocked-over lamp in a gambling tent, and the whole city can go up in flames. And it does, repeatedly. You wake one night to the sound of shouting and the orange glow of fire against your tent wall. A hotel 2 streets over is a roaring inferno. There's no organized response. Instead, volunteer fire companies, which are essentially social clubs with a water pump, rush to the scene. They are often more interested in fighting each other for the right to put out the fire and loot the burning buildings than in actually saving the city. You watch, helpless as a whole block of the city you're just getting to know is reduced to ash and smoldering timber. The next morning, before the ground is even cooled, men are there with hammers and saws, rebuilding. The relentless manic energy of the place is astonishing. San Francisco doesn't have time to mourn. It only has time to build, burn, and build again. Disease is a quieter, but far more effective, killer. The lack of sanitation is appalling. The water comes from contaminated wells. Garbage is thrown into the street. The mud you walk through is a breeding ground for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid diseases people just call the fever or the ague. You see men sicken and die in a matter of days, their bodies often buried in shallow graves on a nearby hill with little ceremony. There are doctors, but they charge a literal ounce of gold, about $16, just for a consultation. Most men can't afford that. They rely on patent medicines or home remedies that do more harm than good. You learn to be careful. You boil all your water. You avoid the cheap oysters sold on the street. You wash your hands obsessively. You are living through a public health crisis that no one has the time or inclination to solve. Survival here is not just about finding gold. It's about dodging the dozens of other ways the city can kill you, from a stray bullet to a bad clam. Every morning you wake up without a fever feels like a victory, a small nugget of luck in a place that's stingy with it. You are starting to understand that the real treasure isn't buried in the Sierra Nevada. It's the simple act of staying alive long enough to get there. After 2 long months of hauling crates, sleeping on dirt, and eating overpriced beans, you have finally scraped together your stake. You have a sturdy pickaxe, a shovel with a strong hickory handle, a metal pan, a wool blanket, and a sack filled with flour, salt pork, and coffee. It's a pathetic little collection of goods, but it represents a small fortune, the sum total of all your labor and self-denial. You and 2 of your former shipmates, a lanky Irishman named Finn and a quiet Swede named Lars, pool your resources to buy passage on a riverboat heading up the Sacramento River. The steamboat is a microcosm of the gold rush itself, dangerously overcrowded, belching black smoke, and filled with a cargo of mismatched, hopeful souls. You are packed onto the deck so tightly you can barely move. There are farmers from Missouri, clerks from New York, sailors from every port, and even a few men in tweed jackets who look like they should be in a university library, not on their way to a mining camp. They are all clutching their new shovels like holy relics. The mood is a strange cocktail of giddy excitement and nervous anxiety. Everyone is telling stories they've heard of men finding nuggets the size of their fist, of streams where the riverbed glitters with gold. No one tells the stories of the men who come back with nothing but dysentery and broken dreams. The journey upriver takes you from the muddy flats of the delta into the rolling oak-studded hills of the interior. It's beautiful country, a landscape of golden grasses and deep green trees that seems peaceful and untouched. But as you get closer to the diggings, the signs of the rush are everywhere. The riverbanks are scarred with pits and trenches. The water itself runs murky and brown, choked with the silt and mud washed away by thousands of miners upstream. The idyllic landscape is being systematically dismantled in the search for wealth. You disembark at a place that is little more than a collection of shanties and tents clustered around a bend in the river. This is it, the gold fields. It looks less like a land of opportunity and more like a massive, disorganized construction site. The sound is a constant chorus of metal on rock, of shouting men, and of the rhythmic, sloshing sound of the rockers and cradles used to separate gold from gravel. There are men everywhere, lining the banks of the river, standing waist-deep in the freezing water, digging, sifting, washing. Every square foot of accessible ground seems to be claimed. The stories of just bending down and picking up nuggets were, you now see with painful clarity, a complete and utter lie. The easy gold, the surface-level placer deposits, was gone within the first 6 months of the rush. You are late to the party, and the hosts have already taken all the good stuff. You, Finn, and Lars find a small, unclaimed patch of riverbank a mile upstream from the main camp. It's a steep, rocky bit of ground that others have likely passed over as too difficult. You don't have a choice. You stake your claim by driving a few wooden posts into the ground with your names crudely carved on them. This is your kingdom. A 12 by 12-foot plot of wet rocks. The work is harder than anything you ever did at sea. From sunup to sundown, you are in the river. The water is so cold it makes your bones ache. You spend hours shoveling heavy, wet gravel from the riverbed into your pan. Then comes the panning itself, a skill that looks simple but is deceptively difficult. You have to swirl the water and gravel in the pan with a specific rolling motion, allowing the lighter sand and pebbles to wash over the edge, while the heavier materials, hopefully including gold, settle at the bottom. It's a delicate, wrist-straining dance. For the first few days, you find nothing. The pan is always empty, except for a few specks of black sand, iron pyrite, fool's gold. The disappointment is a physical weight. Finn, ever the optimist, keeps spirits up with old sea shanties. Lars just works in grim, determined silence. You feel a familiar despair creeping in, the same hopelessness you felt on the whaling ship. You've traded one form of backbreaking, low-reward labor for another, only this one is much, much colder. Finally, on the fourth day, you see it. After washing away the last of the gravel, there in the bottom of your pan are 3 tiny, gleaming yellow flakes. They are no bigger than a grain of sand, but they shine with a light that feels holy. You let out a whoop. Finn and Lars crowd around. It's real. It actually exists. The 3 flakes are probably worth less than 10 cents, but that doesn't matter. It's proof. The hope that had been draining away comes rushing back. For the next few weeks, this is your life. 10 hours a day in the icy river, and at the end of it, you might have a small pinch of gold dust to show for your efforts. You collect it carefully in a small leather pouch. Slowly, painstakingly, it grows. You learn the craft, how to read the river, to look for places behind large boulders or on the inside of bends where the current slows and heavy gold might settle. You and your partners build a rocker, a wooden sluice box that can process more gravel than a simple pan. It's an improvement, but the work is still grueling. The mining camp is a society stripped to its bare essentials. There is no law but the informal miner's code. A man's claim is his property, and trying to work another man's claim jumping is the most serious crime imaginable, often punished with a flogging or banishment from the camp. Theft is a close second. A man's tools and his gold are his life, and they are guarded jealously. Disputes are settled by a miners' meeting, where all the men in the area gather to act as judge and jury. The justice is swift, brutal, and final. You see a man accused of stealing another's pouch of gold. He's given a 5-minute trial, found guilty, and summarily hanged from the branch of an oak tree. It's a sobering reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization really is. Your diet is monotonous and unhealthy. Flour, water, and bacon grease mixed into a paste and fried in a pan. That's flapjacks, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Fresh vegetables are non-existent. Fruits are a distant memory. You start to feel the effects. Your gums are sore and bleed when you brush them with a twig. Old scars on your body begin to ache. It's the first sign of scurvy, the sailor's old enemy, come to find you on dry land. The great irony is that you are surrounded by the bounty of nature, but you are all slowly starving from malnutrition because you are too focused on the yellow metal in the river to hunt, fish, or forage. You are literally destroying the natural world around you in search of wealth, while ignoring the real riches that could keep you alive. After 3 months, you take stock. The pouch of gold dust you, Finn, and Lars have collected is substantial. It might be $400 worth. Divided by 3, after subtracting the exorbitant cost of your supplies, you've each made about what you would have made in a year on the whaling ship. But you've paid for it with your health. You are thinner. Your body is racked with aches, and the scurvy is getting worse. You look at the scarred landscape, the muddy river, the gaunt, haunted faces of the other miners, and a new thought begins to form, a thought that feels like a betrayal of the dream that brought you here. The real gold isn't in this river. The real gold is back in the mud pit of San Francisco. The decision to leave the diggings is harder than the decision to desert the Albatross asterisk. It feels like admitting defeat. Finn is reluctant. He's convinced the mother lode, a mythical vein of pure gold, is just one shovelful away. It always is. But you and Lars are resolute. You've seen enough. You're not getting rich here. You're just getting old and sick. The real money, you've finally truly understood, is not being made by the producers of gold, but by the suppliers of goods and services to the producers. It's the man who sold you the shovel for 10 times its worth. It's the ferryman who charged you a fortune to cross the river. It's the saloon keeper selling rot-gut whiskey for an ounce of dust a bottle. They were the smart ones. They weren't gambling on finding gold. They were providing the picks and pans for the casino, and the house always wins. You sell your claim and your tools to a group of newcomers, their faces still clean and full of the same naive hope you once had. You don't have the heart to tell them the truth. You take your share of the gold dust and head back downriver. Returning to San Francisco is like entering a different world. In the few months you've been gone, the city has transformed. The tent city is still there, but now there are more substantial wooden buildings, 2- and 3-story hotels, and proper warehouses. The population has doubled. The mud is just as bad, but the chaos is more organized, more commercial. The get-rich-quick energy is still there, but it's shifting from prospecting to speculation. You don't want to be a prospector anymore. You want to be a businessman. With your $120 in gold dust, a veritable fortune by your old standards, you look for an opportunity. You see men everywhere trying to get their laundry done. They are washing their clothes in buckets, badly, and hanging them on bushes to dry. The few laundries that exist are overwhelmed and charge astronomical prices, $8 to wash a dozen shirts. The work is done almost exclusively by Chinese immigrants or the very few women in the city, and they are making a killing. But you have a different idea. You look out at the bay, at the silent forest of abandoned ships, your old life, your prison, and you see an opportunity. You find the captain of a recently abandoned ship, a man deep in his cups in a waterfront saloon, and you make him an offer. You and your partners will pay him to use his ship as a warehouse. He's planning on leaving it to rot anyway. He agrees. You now have a secure, dry place to store goods, floating right in the harbor. You are no longer hauling crates. You are charging other people to store the crates you used to haul. You use your skills as a sailor to rig up efficient block and tackle systems to lift cargo. You become a lighterman, operating a small boat to ferry goods from newly arrived ships to your floating warehouse, and then to the shore, charging a premium for every step. It works. The money starts to come in, and it's more reliable than panning for gold. You are no longer at the mercy of luck. You are leveraging your specific knowledge, your understanding of ships, tides, and cargo to solve a problem. You are mining the supply chain. You buy another abandoned ship, the Euphemia *, and you and your partners, with the help of a carpenter, convert it into a floating hotel, and in a fit of civic-mindedness mixed with opportunism, the city's first jail. The city has no official buildings, so they pay you handsomely to house their drunks and criminals. You, the former deserter and thief, are now a government contractor, a pillar of the burgeoning community. You look out over the city from the deck of your ship-turned business. San Francisco is still a chaotic, muddy, dangerous place. It will burn down and be rebuilt half a dozen more times, but it is becoming a city. A real city, built on a foundation of greed, hope, desperation, and hundreds of scuttled ships, just like the one you're standing on. You came here chasing a fool's dream of finding gold in a river. You endured hardship, sickness, and the crushing disappointment of reality. But you learned the great lesson of the gold rush. The treasure was never the gold itself. It was the explosive, chaotic, and unbelievably profitable business of building a world from scratch for all the other fools who came looking for it. You didn't strike it rich. You got smart. And in 1849 San Francisco, that was a much rarer and more valuable thing than gold. You are no longer just a survivor. You are a founder. As our journey through the birth of Gold Rush San Francisco concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient mystery that still makes us wonder. This is the Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Our next story is The Executioner's Diary, a family that had a 200-year contract to kill. Hope you enjoy it. Let's be honest for a moment. When you picture a historical executioner, what comes to mind? Probably some hulking, anonymous brute in a black hood, right? A grunting monosyllabic ogre who sharpens his axe in a dank dungeon, communicates exclusively in threatening gestures, and has the intellectual curiosity of a particularly dim-witted paving stone. He's a monster, a social outcast, a necessary evil kept in a cage until it's time to do the state's dirty work. He's less a man and more a piece of grim, state-owned machinery, a caricature drawn by centuries of Gothic horror and Hollywood oversimplification. We imagine him as someone fundamentally different from us, unfeeling, cruel, perhaps even enjoying his work. This is the image we've been sold, the convenient fiction that allows us to place the act of state-sanctioned killing at a comfortable distance, performed by a monster for a monstrous purpose. We imagine a simple, brutal man for a simple, brutal job. And it's a comforting thought in its own dark way, because it means we don't have to think too hard about the person holding the sword or pulling the lever. It allows us to believe that the system of justice, however flawed, is at least carried out by someone who isn't wrestling with the same complexities and contradictions that we do. We like our monsters to be simple. It was all a lie. Tonight, you are Charles Henry Sanson. It is the latter half of the 18th century in Paris, the glittering, chaotic heart of a kingdom stumbling towards a revolution it cannot yet imagine. You are the asterisk executeur des hautes oeuvres asterisk, the executor of high works, a rather poetic title for the royal executioner. You are a fourth-generation executioner, and the family business, this strange and terrible inheritance, is yours to command. You are a respected government official, a man of science, a skilled anatomist, an amateur physician who treats the poor for free. You are a devoted husband and father. You are well-read, thoughtful, and you personally find capital punishment distasteful, even barbaric. And your job, your life's work, is to kill people on behalf of the King of France. The proof of this complicated reality, the thing that shatters the cartoonish myth of the brutish executioner, isn't a gleaming axe or a blood-stained block. It's something far more mundane, and therefore far more powerful, your family's ledgers, your diaries. For generations, your family has kept meticulous records. These aren't the rantings of monsters. They're the ultimate historical receipts. They are detailed business accounts, logging expenses for straw to soak up the blood, for new ropes, for the upkeep of the scaffold. They are medical journals filled with observations on human anatomy, learned through your grim work. They are personal diaries, filled with notes about the weather, complaints about the price of bread, and quiet, soul-weary reflections on the weight of your office. These documents are the undeniable, bureaucratic evidence of a life lived at the strangest intersection of domestic normality and state-sponsored terror. This discovery, revealed through the careful preservation of your family's extensive records, reveals something extraordinary about the nature of justice, duty, and the surprising humanity of those tasked with society's most inhuman jobs. As we settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just what historians have found in these records, but what it tells us about the surprisingly relatable lives of people who lived in 18th century Paris. Now dim the lights, and prepare to discover why this story will change how you think about the man in the black hood. Your story doesn't begin in a dungeon, but in a rather comfortable, respectable house in the Faubourg Saint-Denis, a part of Paris known as the asterisk Cour des Miracles, asterisk the Court of Miracles. It's a name that drips with a certain kind of irony you'll come to appreciate later in life. Your home is set apart, a little island of quiet dignity in a city that buzzes with nervous energy. It's a large home because it needs to be. It houses not just your family, but the instruments of your trade, the legacy of your ancestors, and the heavy, invisible mantle of your profession. Growing up, you don't immediately understand what your father does. You are a Sanson, and that name carries a weight you can feel before you can comprehend it. Other children in the street sometimes fall silent when you approach. Their parents pull them away with a nervous glance, a whispered word you can't quite catch. You are not invited to play games. You are treated with a strange mixture of fear and a wide-berth deference, as if you are a piece of unexploded ordnance. You learn very early on what it is to be profoundly alone in a crowd. Your father, Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson, is a kind man. He is quiet, thoughtful, and his hands, which you will one day watch perform the most terrible acts, are gentle when he tends to the roses in your family's walled garden. He teaches you Latin and anatomy. He encourages you to read the great philosophers. He speaks of duty, of honor, of service to the crown. He never speaks of the scaffold, not at first. The family business is a ghost that lives in your house, present in every room, but never acknowledged at the dinner table. It's in the locked sheds in the courtyard, in the faint metallic smell that sometimes clings to your father's coat, in the way he sometimes stares into the middle distance, his eyes seeing something far away and long ago. The moment of revelation, when it comes, is not dramatic. There is no grand speech. You are a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, and you are accompanying your father on an errand in the city. You are in the Place de Grève, the main public square where Parisians gather to shop, to gossip, to protest, and to watch the public spectacles that pass for entertainment. And on this day, the spectacle is justice. A scaffold has been erected. Great crowd has gathered, a murmuring, restless sea of humanity. You feel a knot of dread in your stomach, and then you see the men on the platform, preparing. One of them turns, and you see his face. It's your uncle. Your father says nothing. He simply places a hand on your shoulder, his grip firm, steady. He doesn't need to explain. In that silent moment, you understand everything. You understand the whispers, the fear in the eyes of your neighbors, the isolation. You understand what the name Sanson means. It is the name of death. Your family doesn't just work for the state. Your family asterisk is asterisk the final brutal punctuation mark at the end of its legal sentences. Your inheritance isn't land or titles. It's the sword of justice, the breaking wheel, the gibbet, and the terrible, lonely duty that comes with them. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. This is your future. There is no escape. The family has a contract with the crown, a tradition stretching back to the 1680s. You are the next link in a chain forged of iron and bone. Your education now takes on a new, grimly practical dimension. Alongside your studies of Voltaire and Rousseau, you learn the family trade. This is not the work of a brute. It is a science, a craft demanding immense skill, precision, and a detached professionalism that borders on the profound. Your father teaches you anatomy, not with books, but with the unfortunate subjects the state provides. You learn the precise location of every bone, every muscle, every nerve. This knowledge is crucial, not for cruelty, but for its opposite. A proper execution in the pre-guillotine era could be an act of relative mercy or an agonizing, prolonged torture, and the difference lay entirely in your skill. When breaking a criminal on the wheel, you must know exactly where to strike with the iron bar to shatter the limbs without killing the condemned outright. The sentence demands a specific sequence of suffering, and it is your duty to deliver it precisely as the court ordered. You are a technician of pain, a bureaucrat of agony. To do it well, to be a good executioner, means being an expert in the very thing you are supposed to be ending, life in all its fragile biological complexity. You learn to wield the executioner's sword, a heavy two-handed blade that requires incredible strength and pinpoint accuracy to sever a head in a single, clean stroke. A botched beheading is a professional disgrace, a horror for the crowd, and an unimaginable end for the condemned. It is the ultimate failure, and it haunts the dreams of every man in your family. But your life is not confined to the scaffold. In a strange paradox, your intimate knowledge of the human body makes you a sought-after healer. The Sansons have a side business, a tradition as old as the executioner's office itself. You are doctors to the poor, people who cannot afford a physician, people who are shunned by polite society, come to your family's door. They come with broken bones, with illnesses, with ailments of every kind, and you treat them. You set their bones with a skill no university-trained doctor can match, because you have seen, in the most visceral way imaginable, how the human frame is put together and how it can be broken. You prescribe remedies, you offer counsel. In the same hands that deliver the king's justice, you deliver quiet acts of mercy. You live a bizarre dual life. In the morning, you might prepare the instruments for a public torture. In the afternoon, you might be gently setting the arm of a child who fell from a tree. This is the reality of being a Sanson. You are both the most feared and, in some corners of Paris, the most trusted man in the city. You are a purveyor of death and a giver of life, a monster and a savior, depending on which door of your house a person knocks upon. A typical day, before the world turned upside down, begins with the quiet rhythms of any other bourgeois household. You rise, you have coffee, you read the papers, you attend to your correspondence. Much of it is official. You receive orders from the courts, schedules for upcoming executions, warrants to be signed. It is all deeply, chillingly bureaucratic. You fill out requisitions for supplies. You are, in essence, a small business owner, and your business is death. You review the case of the next man you are to execute. You read the charges, the judgment. You need to know what the sentence entails. Is it a simple hanging? Or is it something more elaborate, more theatrical? The *ancien regime* loves its spectacle. Justice isn't just done. It must be seen to be done, often in the most horrifying way imaginable. Today, let's say the sentence is breaking on the wheel for a man convicted of highway robbery and murder. Your preparations begin. You and your assistants, often family members, as few others would take the job, inspect the *, the heavy wooden wheel. You check the iron bar. You ensure the ropes are strong. Every detail must be perfect. There is no room for error. A snapped rope or a splintered wheel would turn a solemn state ritual into a farce. And the crowd, your ever-present, bloodthirsty audience, does not appreciate farce. As you work, you are detached. You must be. You focus on the mechanics, the physics of the task ahead. You are a craftsman preparing his tools. You cannot afford to think about the man. To think of him as a person with a family, with fears, with a life that is about to be systematically dismantled by your hands, is a path to madness. You have built walls inside your mind, thick and high, to separate the man who tends his garden from the man who wields the iron bar. It is the only way to survive. The journey to the place de grave is a ritual in itself. You ride in a cart, seated beside the condemned. The city of Paris parts for you. The crowds are already lining the streets. They jeer, they spit, they throw things. Their hatred is a physical force, a wave of revulsion directed at the man in the cart and at you. They need you for their catharsis, for this grim theater, but they despise you for it. You are the priest of a dark religion they all secretly worship. You sit in silence, your face a mask of professional indifference. You do not speak to the condemned unless spoken to. Sometimes they pray. Sometimes they weep. Sometimes they curse you. You absorb it all. It is part of the job. On the scaffold, you work with a swift, practiced efficiency. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of cheap wine, of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of fear. The crowd roars. It is a single beast, a many-headed hydra, and it is hungry. You and your assistants bind the man to the wheel. You take up the iron bar. You do not look at his face. You look at his limbs. You are a surgeon in reverse. You know the points of impact, the lines of force. You raise the bar. The crowd holds its breath. You bring it down. The crack of bone is sickeningly loud, a sound that cuts through the roar of the mob. You work your way up the body, methodically, following the letter of the law. 2 strikes per limb. Then the chest, the asterisk coup de gr ace asterisk, the final blow. Mercy, delivered with a piece of iron. Afterward, there is more paperwork. You must file a report confirming the sentence has been carried out. A death certificate of sorts, signed by your hand. You collect your fee from the royal treasury. It is a good living, but you can never wash the stain of it away. You return home. You shed the red coat of your office, a garment that marks you as clearly as a brand. You wash your hands, scrubbing them until they are raw, but the feeling never quite leaves. You sit down to dinner with your wife and children. They ask you about your day, and you lie. You speak of errands, of paperwork, of the price of goods at the market. You do this to protect them, and to protect what little remains of your own soul. You try to be the man who tends the roses, not the man who wields the iron bar. But some nights, you wake in a cold sweat, the sound of cracking bone echoing in the silent house. You are a good man in an impossible job, a jailer of your own conscience. And the world outside your quiet garden is beginning to churn, to curl. You can hear the whispers of revolution on the wind, and you have a dreadful sinking feeling that your services are about to be in very high demand. You worry that the walls you've built inside your mind may not be strong enough to withstand the storm that is coming. The late 1780s are a strange time to be you. Paris is a city holding its breath, a powder keg with a sputtering fuse. You read the pamphlets that are passed hand to hand on street corners, the ones filled with radical ideas about liberty, equality, and fraternity. You read the works of the Enlightenment philosophers, men who argue for reason, for science, for a more humane world. And in the quiet of your study, surrounded by your medical texts and anatomical charts, you find yourself agreeing with them. You, the king's executioner, are a quiet supporter of reform. This is the central, agonizing contradiction of your life. Your profession is the very embodiment of the *ancien regime's brutal, arbitrary power. You are the living symbol of a system of justice that relies on terror and spectacle. The breaking wheel, the gibbet, the public drawing and quartering, these are not the tools of an enlightened age. They are relics of a darker time, and you know it. You feel the hypocrisy of your position, like a physical weight. You are a man of science and reason, trapped in a medieval nightmare of the state's own making. Your unique position gives you a perspective few others have. You see the end result of the system's failures. The men and women you lead to the scaffold are rarely aristocrats. They are the poor, the desperate, the forgotten. They are driven to crime by hunger and a system that offers them no hope. You are the final, bloody consequence of a society that is deeply, fundamentally unjust. And you are tired of it. You are tired of the barbarity. You are tired of being the instrument of a cruelty you no longer believe in. It is in this frame of mind that you first make the acquaintance of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. He is a physician and a politician, a man driven by a genuine, if somewhat clinical, humanitarian impulse. He, like you, is horrified by the spectacle of public executions. He sees the prolonged agony of a hanging or the gruesome imprecision of a breaking on the wheel as a stain on the nation. He proposes a new way, a machine that would make death swift, painless, and equal for all. No longer would a nobleman have the privilege of a clean beheading by sword, while a commoner suffered on the wheel. Under this new system, death would be the great equalizer. He seeks you out for your professional opinion. You are, after all, the kingdom's foremost expert on the subject of state-sanctioned death. You meet with him, perhaps in secret at first, sharing your knowledge. You explain the practical difficulties of beheading with a sword, how the blade dulls, how the aim can falter, how it requires immense strength and skill that not all executioners possess. You describe the mechanics of hanging, how a miscalculation can lead to slow strangulation instead of a quick death. You provide the grim, practical data for his humanitarian theory. Together with a German engineer named Tobias Schmidt, you help refine the design. You suggest changes based on your experience. The crescent-shaped blade, the lunette to hold the neck steady, the height of the uprights, the weight of the blade required to sever a human neck cleanly every single time. You are not inventing a monster. You believe you are perfecting a tool of mercy. This machine, which will one day bear Dr. Guillotine's name and become a symbol of terror, is, to you, a profound step forward. It represents a victory for science and reason over barbaric tradition. It will make your terrible job more efficient, yes, but also more humane. It promises an end to the spectacle of suffering. It promises a quiet, mechanical precision. You see it as the end of torture, not the beginning of a new terror. You have no idea how wrong you are. You have no idea how many times you will have to hear the sound of that blade falling. The revolution explodes across Paris like a fever. The Bastille falls. The king is brought from Versailles to the city, a virtual prisoner of his own people. And your life is turned upside down. You are no longer the royal executioner. You are now the citizen executioner, an employee of the new republic. Your master has changed, but your job remains the same. In fact, it gets busier. The revolutionary tribunals are working overtime. In April of 1792, the new machine is ready. It is erected in the Place de Grève, the same square where you have performed so many brutal medieval punishments. The first execution is for a common highwayman named Nicholas Pelletier. The crowd is enormous, but they are not roaring with bloodlust. They are curious. They have come to see the new invention, this scientific marvel. You conduct the proceedings with your usual solemn professionalism. The condemned is strapped to the board. The rope is released. The blade falls with a heavy, final asterisk thud asterisk. It is over in less than a second. The crowd is silent for a moment, and then they begin to grumble. They are disappointed. It was too quick. There was no struggle, no drama, no protracted suffering to savor. They feel cheated. They came for a spectacle and were given a sterile, mechanical event. In that moment, you realize a terrifying truth. You and Dr. Guillotine, in your quest for a humane death, have misunderstood the very nature of public execution. You thought the goal was justice. For the crowd, the goal was always the show. And you have just replaced a gruesome theatrical tragedy with a brutally efficient 2-second-long industrial process. But the machine is here to stay. It is efficient, it is egalitarian, and the new government has a great deal of work for it to do. The lists of the condemned grow longer. Royalists, counter-revolutionaries, priests who refuse to swear allegiance to the new state. The work becomes a relentless rhythm, a grim cadence set by the fall of the blade. You are a functionary in a vast, impersonal system of death. Then comes the day you have been dreading, the day that will define your life and your legacy. January 21st, 1793, you are ordered to execute Citizen Louis Capet, formerly known as King Louis XVI, the man your family has served for generations. The man who was, in the old world, the divine source of the very justice you were tasked to dispense. This is not just another execution. This is the death of 1,000 years of history, and you have been chosen to be its midwife. The night before is the longest of your life. You barely sleep. The weight of this act is immense. You are at heart a small c conservative, a man who believes in order and tradition. You feel a deep, personal sense of sorrow for the king, a man you see as weak and indecisive, but not evil. Yet, you are also a servant of the state. Your duty is to the law, regardless of who writes it. To refuse would be treason. It would mean your own head would be the next to fall, and your family's legacy, their very survival, would end with you. So you will do your duty. As a Sanson always has, the morning is cold and damp. Paris is a city under armed guard. 80,000 soldiers line the streets to prevent any attempt to rescue the king. The city is eerily silent. The usual chaotic noise is gone, replaced by a tense, expectant hush. You prepare yourself, dressing in your work clothes, your movements slow and deliberate. You meet the convoy that has brought Louis from his prison at the temple. He is calm, dignified. He carries himself with a quiet resolve that impresses you. The journey to the Place de la Revolution, what is now the Place de la Concorde, is agonizingly slow. The crowd is the largest you have ever seen, a vast, silent ocean of faces. You can feel their eyes on you, on the king. On the scaffold, Louis attempts to address the people. His voice is strong. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," he begins. But the commander of the National Guard, a man named Santerre, orders a drum roll to drown out his words. The Republic is not interested in the final words of a king. Your assistants remove his coat. He resists when they try to bind his hands, a flicker of his old royal pride. "Will you suffer this new indignity?" he asks. You lean in, your voice low and respectful. You explain it is a necessary precaution. You tell him your predecessor had to do the same for Charles, the First of England. The historical parallel seems to calm him, to place his personal humiliation within a larger historical context. He submits. He is positioned on the bascule, the plank. His head is placed in the lunette. For a moment, you pause. You look out at the silent sea of faces, at the gray Parisian sky. You are Charles Henry Sanson, son of an executioner, grandson of an executioner. You are a man who loves science, a man who treats the poor, a man who simply wanted to live a quiet life. And you are about to kill a king. You give the signal. The rope is released. The blade falls. In the aftermath, as one of your assistants holds the severed head up to the crowd, the silence is broken. A few cries of "Vive la Republique" begin, and soon it swells into a roar. The spell is broken. The crowd surges forward, people dipping handkerchiefs in the king's blood, seeking a macabre souvenir of this world-changing moment. You stand back, watching, feeling nothing but a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. You have done your duty. And in doing so, you have helped birth a new, terrifying world. The work has only just begun. The reign of terror is at your door, and it will demand more blood than you could ever have imagined. The execution of the king is not the end. It is the beginning. It opens a floodgate, and a tide of blood washes over Paris. The period that history will call the Reign of Terror begins, and you are at its epicenter. Your life ceases to have a rhythm. It is now a relentless, monotonous grind. The guillotine, the machine you helped create as an instrument of humane progress, becomes the symbol of revolutionary fanaticism. It is no longer a tool of justice. It is a tool of political extermination. Your days become a blur of names and faces. The tumbrils, the open carts that carry the condemned, arrive at the scaffold in a seemingly endless procession. First, it is the Queen, Marie Antoinette, a shadow of her former self, but still possessing a core of regal dignity that even you must admire. Then come the Girondins, the early revolutionaries who are now deemed too moderate. Then come the Hebertists, the radicals who are deemed too extreme. Then comes Danton, the charismatic orator of the revolution, who on the scaffold famously tells you, "Show my head to the people." It is worth seeing. And finally, it is Robespierre himself, the architect of the terror, his jaw shattered by a botched suicide attempt, unable to speak as he is led to the very machine that was the engine of his power. You execute them all. You are the one constant in a city gone mad. You serve the Committee of Public Safety with the same professional detachment with which you serve the king. You are a boatman on the river Styx, ferrying soul after soul to the other side, regardless of their politics or station. Your son, Henry, now works alongside you. You are training him to take over the family business, just as your father trained you. But you worry about the toll it is taking on him. You have had decades to build the walls in your mind. He is a young man, and he has been thrown into a slaughterhouse. You see the light dimming in his eyes with every fall of the blade. The sheer scale of the killing is staggering. At the peak of the terror, you are executing dozens of people a day. The Place de la Revolution stinks of blood, a sweet, metallic odor that clings to the air, to your clothes, to your hair. The blade must be sharpened constantly. The mechanics of the guillotine must be maintained. The paperwork is overwhelming. You are still required to keep your ledgers, to record the name of every person executed. The pages fill with names, a stark, bureaucratic testament to the horror. You become an automaton. You wake, you work, you return home, you try to sleep. There is no room for thought, for feeling. There is only the process. The bathos of it all is what keeps you sane. You find yourself focusing on the mundane, absurd details. The way a certain politician's wig fell off as he was strapped to the board. The complaint from the citizens living near the square about the blood seeping into their cellars. The logistical problem of where to bury all the bodies. The cemeteries are overflowing. New pits have to be dug. You are not just an executioner. You are a manager in a massive, state-run death industry. You have become numb. It is a mercy. The man who once agonized over the morality of his profession is gone, buried under a mountain of corpses. All that is left is the functionary, the man who pulls the rope and signs the forms. You develop a kind of gallows humor, a dark, private coping mechanism. You are the ultimate survivor. You have watched every major figure of the last decade, from the king to the men who killed him, pass before you on their way to oblivion. You have outlasted them all. You are the final arbiter, the one man no one can afford to make an enemy of. There is a certain grim power in that. You are the most feared man in France, and also the most necessary. You are a living paradox, a man whose hands are soaked in the blood of his nation, yet whose survival depends on his utter neutrality. You are simply the instrument. You do not judge. You only execute. Then one day, as suddenly as it began, it is over. The terror burns itself out. Robespierre's death breaks the fever. A new government, the Directory, takes over. The pace of executions slows to a trickle, then almost stops. The city of Paris exhales, a long, shuddering sigh of relief. And you are left in the silence, amidst the ghosts. You are an old man now. The years of relentless work have taken their toll. Your hands tremble sometimes. You see the faces of the dead in your dreams. In 1795, you decide it is time. You are weary, so profoundly weary, down to your very bones. You officially retire, passing the office, the title, and the terrible burden to your son Henry. He is the fifth Sanson to hold the post. You watch him don the red coat, and you feel a complex mixture of pride and profound sorrow. You have ensured the family's survival, the continuation of the contract. But you have also condemned your son to the same haunted life you have lived. You retreat to the quiet of your home. You spend your final years tending your garden, the same garden where your father taught you about duty and honor so long ago. You work the soil, you prune the roses, you try to cultivate life to make up for the lifetime you spent dealing in death. And you begin to write. You write your memoirs, filling page after page with the story of your life, trying to make sense of it all. You are trying to explain, perhaps to the world, perhaps just to yourself, how a man can be a healer and a killer, a man of reason and an agent of terror. You are trying to find the man you were before the revolution buried him. You lived to see the rise of Napoleon. You have served a king, a republic, and now an emperor. You have been the one fixed point in an age of chaos. You die in 1806, a quiet death in your own bed, a peaceful end you denied to so many thousands of others. Your son, and then your grandson, will continue the family business, right up until 1847. 6 generations of Sansons serving the state, their name forever synonymous with the guillotine. You were its most famous wielder, the man who stood at the crossroads of history and did his terrible necessary duty. You were not a monster. You were a man, burdened by a legacy you did not choose, who navigated a nightmare with a quiet, lonely, and professional dignity. Your ledgers are the proof. They are the final, eloquent testimony of the executioner who dreamed of a more humane world. As our journey through the life of Charles Henry Sanson concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry, woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient mystery that still makes us wonder. This is The Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Good night.